Hello, my name is Camilla Elliott. I teach in the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Lancaster University. Today I want to speak to you about some ways in which evil is represented in Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886. In part one of this series, we looked at how evil is defined in the book. In part two, we will look at the relationship between evil and social categories, by which I mean class, gender, age, and so on. The aim of these sessions is to support your studies and also to introduce you to some of the approaches you might encounter should you choose to study English literature at university. In this session, I will talk for a few minutes and then ask you to pause the video and work on a task. We will go back and forth in this way until the end of the session, where you will find a list of resources for you to continue researching and reading on your own. In Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, there is a clear association of the lower classes with the lower soul. Jekyll writes of Hyde, "He bore the stamp of lower elements in my soul." The lower soul was seen to house the worst aspects of a person, the primal instincts and unbridled desires, unethical feelings and impulses, all the parts of which people were most ashamed and most sought to hide. Also the part connected to animals, by contrast to the higher soul that reaches towards the divine. The lower soul was not only destined for the nether regions of hell, but was also associated with the lower classes in British society in this world. Although Hyde is not lower class, he is of a lower rank in society than Jekyll. Hyde lives in Soho, Jekyll lives in upmarket London. Even within Jekyll's upmarket home, Jekyll goes in the front entrance while Hyde sneaks in a back entrance on a by street used by tradesmen and servants. Take some time now, if you would like, to look at the ways in which Jekyll and Hyde inhabit Jekyll's house. Not just the doors through which they enter the house, but also their relationship to other things in the home, to windows, to rooms, to drawers, to the smaller spaces of cabinets, boxes, and even envelopes. Also look at their relationships to the household staff. Write down what differences you find, but also take a look and see if there are any similarities. Pause the video now to do this, and when you're ready, continue on. Another way to think about evil and social categories is to ask, who are the victims of Hyde's violence? What social categories do they inhabit? What is their class? What is their gender? What is their profession? What is their age? And what is their moral character like? Pause the video now to write down your answers to these questions, and when you are ready, continue. The first act of violence is when Hyde tramples a young working-class girl aged between 8 and 10. This is not a crime of passion. Hyde simply cannot be bothered to step around the fallen child after he bumps into her and knocks her over. Instead, he walks over her body while she screams. The fact that his first victim is a child, a female, and from a lower class makes her vulnerable across 3 different social categories. By contrast, the do-gooder Jekyll would probably have sought to care for and help the poor and vulnerable. Hyde's act here not only shows a lack of care for poor children, but also willingness to inflict serious injury on one just to avoid having to take one extra step on his own journey. But the little girl survives the trampling. Hyde's most violent crime is the murder of someone at the opposite end of the class, gender, and age spectrum from that little girl, the elderly, upper-class Member of Parliament, Sir Danvers Carew, who is further elevated by his morals. He seemed to breathe such an innocent and old-world kindness of disposition, yet with something high too, says the maidservant who witnesses his murder. In contrast to the trampling of the little girl, this is a crime of passion. When Carew walks past Hyde, he stops him to ask perhaps for directions or to just exchange some kind of greeting with him. Once again, Hyde's journey has been interrupted, and he erupts this time into a rage and begins to beat Sir Danvers Carew savagely and furiously. He also tramples his victim underfoot, just like he did with the child, eventually beating Carew to death with his club, and only stopping when he is exhausted and at that moment suddenly afraid of being caught. In Jekyll's description of the murder in chapter 10, he tells us that Hyde took tremendous pleasure in inflicting violence and pain on his victim. He states, "I mauled the unresisting body, tasting delight from every blow." What should be really striking to you here is that instead of saying he mauled the unresisting body, Jekyll here says I, taking responsibility for the crime and also sharing in its pleasure. So one thing we need to think about now is, how do the social categories of Hyde and Jekyll's victims relate to the social categories that Jekyll and Hyde inhabit? One of the things that we do at university is we try to move beyond studying characters as psychological beings to think about what issues and what ideas they represent. So, if we put together these two major acts of violence, we can see that the victims are from a different class to Jekyll and Hyde, and that the crimes are committed by a member of the middle class against lower and higher classes, as well as against people who are younger and older than Jekyll and Hyde. We read of one other violent act in chapter 10, that Hyde hit a woman who offered him a box of lights on the street. Offering a box of light is something that prostitutes at the time did to try to solicit customers. So we have here a woman, again below Hyde's class, but we also have the fact, with both the little girl and the prostitute, that the female gender was, in the Victorian period, ranked substantially below the male gender. What we find then in all of these three attacks is an expression of middle-class male hostility and violence towards those in the classes above his own, below his own, and people of different gender and age. I don't know whether you've ever read something that changed the way you thought about a book, but this happened to me when I read an article by Stephen Errata describing Hyde as a middle-class savage. He too looked at the words used to describe Hyde in the book, as we did together in part 1 of this series, but what he discovered was that the most common word to describe Hyde in the book is gentleman, and it's used many more times than any other word. Errata reflects the real horror is not then that a gentleman can regress to be a savage, but that a savage can pass for a gentleman. He also points out that Hyde's crimes are against other classes. But this was not the great revelation for me. The great revelation in reading this article was his interpretation and analysis of what happened when the little girl was trampled. What he points out is that instead of hauling him off to prison, other men, and particularly middle-class men, rally to protect Hyde from the consequence of his actions. Mr. Enfield, a middle-class man who witnessed the crime, says, "We were keeping the women off him as best we could, for they were wild as harpies. I never saw a circle of such hateful faces." Here, strangely, the people who are enraged by Hyde's atrocity are figured in very villainous language, while Hyde himself is being protected by men of his own class. You'll see in other areas of life that sometimes people protesting against abuse are often figured as evil, as violent, and as criminals. And here we have the same kind of dynamic going on. What happens next is even more surprising. Men set off with Hyde. We all set off, the doctor, the child's father, and our friend, and myself, and passed the rest of the night in my chambers, and next day, when we had breakfasted, went in a body to the bank. So here, you see, Hyde is called our friend, and in another passage, he calls him my man. There's a sense of affiliation and association with Hyde, a recognition of a kindred identity. And when they go to the bank together, it's as if they're all in one body, all of these men here. What happens at the bank is that Hyde draws a check, signs it with Jekyll's signature, and Hyde is able to buy himself out of the legal consequences of his violence. If he were a poor man, he would have been hauled off to prison and possibly suffered some kind of violent fate for himself, especially if the child had died. But one of the reasons that this works is because the income disparity between Jekyll and between the victim of Hyde is so great that even a trifling amount of money from Jekyll and Hyde is too much to refuse, and the child's father is the one that agrees not to press charges. After this, Enfield and Utterson, to whom he tells the story, agree that they won't speak of this crime anymore because they don't want to ruin a middle-class gentleman's reputation. So what we see now is that the crimes are not only committed by a middle-class man, but they are supported, accessories to the crime after the fact, by other middle-class men. At university, we also try to understand literary works by thinking about the society in which they're written and what they might be responding to. So in 1886, middle-class men were feeling very threatened by the fact that the working classes had gained the vote with 2 acts of parliament, one in 1884 and 1885. This was not all working class men, but it had increased the electorate substantially from that part of society. They were also forming trades unions. They were advancing socialist economics and politics to try and change the distribution of wealth and privilege in society, and some of them were rioting. The middle classes reacted against this. Punch magazine is one of the most middle class of middle class journals, and you'll see in this slide that was drawn by John Tenniel, you will see a working class man standing beside a large hooded cloaked figure indicative of death with anarchy written across his hood. The man is about to step off a cliff, and the message of this cartoon is don't protest, don't riot, stay in your place, stay in your class, or you're going to die. Women too were campaigning for the vote and for economic, professional, and legal rights. I'd like you to pause this slide for a moment and analyze it. And the questions I'd like you to consider when you do are, how is the middle class man on the left side of the picture represented? What might it mean that he is so large? How do you read the way he's standing? Now look at the women who are banging on the door. How are they drawn? How are they represented? What do they look like? What are they holding? Then compare them to the women behind them on the right who are not asking for the vote and who are looking at them with disapproval. How are they drawn? What are they wearing? What are they carrying? Also, think about the closed door that is presented to the women who want the vote and the open door at the back that the other women have been able to walk through without any barriers. Look at the caption to the cartoon, Ugly Rush, and think about how ugliness has been used in this drawing, again by John Tenniel, who illustrated Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. What does ugliness or beauty have to do with women's rights or with their demand for the vote? How are ugliness and beauty used to value or devalue women who do or do not want the vote? So pause this slide, think about this, write down some notes, and when you're ready, continue. There were other threats to middle-class men, one of which was the decline of the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, a decline that would continue into the 20th century. This was particularly galling to the middle-class men who were, by and large, the main administrators of imperialism. Whereas at home, exploiting and ruling other people was mostly reserved for the British aristocracy, overseas middle-class men could dominate, abuse, and exploit colonized subjects, and this role had greatly increased their authority and their wealth and their power. Late in the 19th century, however, some colonized subjects were protesting against being colonized, and other nations, like America, were competing for imperial power with Britain and fighting Britain overseas. This cartoon here is an American cartoon of a greedy John Bull, the symbol of the quintessential Englishman, who's been drawn with a human head and hands, but octopus tentacles grasping at many different nations. With 13 tentacles, 2 of them below the water, clinging to territory underneath his arms, he is considerably overreaching, even for an octopus. These are just a few of the social issues connecting class and categories to evil in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. What we see is a complicated picture in which evil is associated with the lower classes, but the book's arch-villain is a member of the middle classes committing crimes against classes lower and higher than his own. In this illustration by Charles Raymond Macaulay for the 1904 New York edition of the book, we see a sinister-looking Jekyll emerging from his house with the shadow of Hyde coming at him from another angle. You can see this isn't his shadow because his shadow is reflected on the door. In the same way, it is important when you're studying literary books to look at characters and the issue they raise from a variety of angles, and to look for the shadows of meaning that might be hidden beneath the surface message of the book. If you want to learn more about the battle for the vote or the British Empire, or to read more about Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this slide directs you to some resources you might consult. If you want to know where the pictures in this presentation came from, here are links to where you can find them. Thank you for watching, listening, and participating in this workshop. If you are interested in learning more about what it's like to study English literature or creative writing or both at university, you can start with our website. Do feel free to contact us with any questions.